So the theory that I chose to do is behaviorism. I thought that this theory was very interesting because we are a result of our actions. A famous quote that I always like to remind myself of is, "You cannot control the behavior of others, but you can always choose how you respond to it." So that's pretty much what behaviorism is. So first, let's start off with the goal of a social worker and why we need to know these theories. Their main goal is to help people live their lives as the best versions of themselves and to be advocates. Understanding these theories allows social workers to connect with their clients. So what is behaviorism in a social worker perspective? It explains human behavior by previous experiences, which is learned with interactions from the environment in a process known as conditioning. Conditioning, a reaction to an event or object that can be a learned behavior and can be modified. In understanding behaviorism, conditioning is key, which I will come back to and explain in greater context, because conditioning is really going to help us understand what behaviorism is. It's a major part of the explanation of this theory. The theorist that connects behaviorism to social work is B.F. Skinner. He was a mid-20th century psychologist, and he believed in radical behaviorism. In his definition, he argued that a person's behavior and the environmental factors that influence it are much more crucial to the fundamental understanding of a person's psychological state. His definition explains changes in behavior are the result of an individual's response to events that occur in the environment. Back to conditioning, we're going to compare classical versus operant. So I will explain an example of a classical conditioning to help us better have a better understanding of what classical conditioning is. So after a person continuously opens a door and then feeds a dog, the thought of food makes the dog's salvation occur. At first, the salvation did not start until after the dog saw the food. After a while, the salvation occurred when the door was open because the dog associated the door opening with their feeding. So in classical conditioning, it's more focused on the behavior and why, and the association of the behavior with something else. So explaining classical conditioning will easier help explain Skinner's view on conditioning, which is operant conditioning. This classical conditioning is more simplistic view on conditioning, in which Skinner believed human behavior was more complex than classical conditioning. Skinner believed in the model operant conditioning, which focuses more on the outcomes rather than the behavior itself. Operant conditioning, there are 4 factors that make operant conditioning work, which are positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. So these are the factors that Skinner came up with when he conducted his experiment with the rat, as shown in the picture to the left of the screen. So for the first one, positive reinforcement, it introduces incentive for positive behavior, and it also increases positive behavior. The second one, negative reinforcement, it's an incentive not to behave negatively, and it increases positive behavior as well. For the third one, positive punishment, it is an undesirable punishment when behaving negatively, and it decreases positive behavior. And the fourth one, negative punishment, That's when you're removing the incentive, and this decreases positive behavior. So these are the 4 factors used in B.F. Skinner's experiment as shown in the picture. So operant conditioning looks at the causes of an action and its consequences. Organisms can be controlled by the environment in which they are in, and this is done with reinforcements and/or punishments. So in the picture, it has loudspeakers, lights, responsive lever, food dispenser, and electrified grid. So these are just the factors that Skinner included in his experiment and in which the picture displays. So imagine a rat in a cage, more specifically the Skinner box. And he conducted an interview as shown in the picture, and it has a response lever on the cage that when pressed releases a food pellet into the cage. That is the positive reinforcement. So that's number 1. So by the rat doing that, he learns from that action, he gets a favorable outcome. When the rat pushes the lever too much, he may get a positive punishment, which is the electric shock. So he gets shocked for pushing it too much because if he pushes it too much, he's gonna get too much food and be overweight. So the electric shock will discourage such behavior, teaching the rat a happy medium. So not to push it too much, but not to push it too little where he doesn't have food. A negative reinforcement would be taking away the food. Therefore, this would decrease the behavior and the rat would become unhappy. The example of the rat in Skinner's box is an example of human behaviors are represented by the environment and the influence of making certain decisions. So an example of operant condition in behaviorism in more simple terms would be referred to as the ABC assessment. So A stands for antecedent, which is what leads the behavior. B stands for the behavior. An example of behavior would be anger/violence. And C is the consequence of what happens immediately after. So the anger/violence is one example of the ABC assessment. So that's an example of how to put this this concept into practice, but I will give you a few more. So for example, a professional can identify certain negative behaviors and then develop strategies to change them to produce more positive outcomes. For example, a professional can work with a child who is being disruptive in class to identify factors that may be causing such behavior and then develop strategies to encourage acceptable participation. Another example is professionals could also work to help adjust the behaviors of adults, such as athletes or office workers. For example, professionals can help identify the factors contributing to an athlete's poor performance on the field and show him to adjust his behavior to achieve a desired outcome. In an office, if there is an employee who is creating problems, or perhaps an employee who is struggling to meet certain goals, a professional can help work with the individual to identify the negative behaviors influencing those actions and methods to help achieve more suitable behaviors. And that leads us to our final question, of which we're all wondering, how can we connect this to the social work practice in the field? Understanding behaviorism and its connection with operant conditioning is largely employed as its emphasis is reinforcing positive behavior. For this theory to work, negative behavior should come with punishment and should be put into application immediately and constantly. Behavioral interference gives the social worker a course of action which can be implemented swiftly but can also be evaluated for effectiveness after time. So a social worker is able to see if this theory is being effective for their client, and this will only show after consistency and time. And these are my sources.